Let me welcome everyone to today's Wallace Stegner Center Green Bag presentation. I'm Bob Kiter, Director of the Wallace Stegner Center for Land Resources and the Environment at the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah. And we're very pleased to have you with us today. I should note that this program today and the other three lectures on the area of Utah water law are sponsored jointly by the Wallace Stegner Center and the Audubon Society, and we're very thankful to the Audubon Society for their support for this sort of mini-series of materials introducing Utah water law. Let me begin with our native lands acknowledgement. We acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and the Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous people and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. Today, we'll hear about the Colorado River crisis or opportunity. This is the second in a series of 4 Utah water law lectures. 2 weeks ago, we heard from Attorney Emily Lewis on the fundamentals of Utah water law. On February 16th, we will hear from Rick Malloy on the topic of measuring water use, the good, the bad, and the ugly. He's the Water Conservation Manager for the Central Utah Water Conservancy District. And on March 2nd, we will hear from Yvette Converse, previously the field supervisor of Utah Ecological Services Field Office for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, currently the Chief of Science and Resources for Grand Teton National Park. She will be addressing considering wildlife in water management. All of this is a lead up to, in some ways, the 28th Annual Symposium for the Wallace Stegner Center, which is on the future of the Great Salt Lake. And that symposium is scheduled for March 16th and 17th. It requires registration. That is now open, and one can register by going to the Stegner Center homepage under the College of Law. I should well, let me move on. In terms of Stegner Center events, additional ones upcoming very briefly. Monday, March 27th, we'll hear from Natalie Koch, author and professor of geography and environmental studies at Syracuse University, Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, talking about her recent book, Arid Empires, The Entangled Fates of Arizona and Saudi Arabia. An interesting connection there. On April 6th, we'll hear from Professor Andrew Gulliford from Fort Lewis College, Department of History and Environmental Studies, speaking on his recently published book, Bear's Ears, Landscape of Refuge and Resistance. And then finally, on April 11th, our final program for the spring semester will be presented by Ann Palmer, who has found and examined correspondence by the young Wallace Stegner, and she will be talking about what she has discerned from that correspondence. All of these events are, again, on the website under the calendar of events. Today, Amy Haas is the Executive Director of the Colorado River Authority of Utah. She's uniquely qualified for this position. She's actually serving as the first executive director of this newly formed Colorado River Authority of Utah. In that capacity, she works for the state. She previously has worked in the area of water as the executive director and general counsel for the Upper Colorado River Commission. Before that, she was the general counsel and acting director of the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission. And before that, she served as New Mexico's Upper Colorado River Commissioner and the governor's representative to that commission. She began her career in private practice in New Mexico roughly about 20 years ago and is focused on land use and water law, and she's uniquely qualified to address her topic, the Colorado River crisis or opportunity. Before I turn the podium over to her, let me note that we will take questions through the Slido technology and the app that one can click onto will be available on the media here behind me, and that's the way to submit a question through your cell phone. With that, let me welcome Amy Haas, and please join me in welcoming Amy Haas for today's talk. Thank you for joining us, Amy.
Thank you so much, Bob. I'd like to thank both Bob and the Stegner Center for the invitation today. It's a pretty auspicious week to be talking about the Colorado River. And it also occurred to me there's got to be a Groundhog Day joke in here somewhere, right? Crisis on the Colorado River. Haven't we been here before and before and before? I'll get into that in a minute, but before I do, I'm curious to know how many of you in the audience are law students. Could you raise your hands? Excellent, great. And of the law students, how many of you are interested in a career in water? Excellent. Notice that I'm having you vote before my presentation. I hope we'll still have those numbers at the end. Won't have you vote again, but I appreciate that. I'm also joined today by two of my new staff members. I've got one participating in person and the other remotely. These are two new staff engineers who joined the Colorado River Authority of Utah staff over the last 6 months. In addition to everything that's going on this river, as Bob mentioned, I am standing up a new organization, a new state water entity, and a big part of that is building capacity. So I'd like to just introduce Betsy Morgan, who is in the first row, and then we've got Lily Bosworth, who is zooming in. So I'm thrilled to report that in addition to everything else going on the river, we are standing up this organization. I think it's a very good thing for the state of Utah. So I've got about 10 slides here, and I'd like to get through the slides fairly quickly and allow ample time for Q&A, because I think that a lot of you in the audience and online probably have questions, and there's certainly a reason that you're participating today, so I don't want to overwhelm the discussion today and simply talk at you, but I do feel like it's important to set out some fundamentals, and I'm going to begin with the law of the river. Okay, 1922 compact. Let's begin where it all started. 100 years ago, the 1922 compact was signed, and it is essentially the cornerstone of what we refer to as the law of the river, which is a compendium of laws and treaties and regulation that governs the operations of the river. At a very basic level, it equitably divides and apportions the waters of the Colorado River between the upper and lower basins, and allocates the exclusive beneficial use of 7.5 million acre feet to each basin. It also provides the lower basin an additional 1 million acre feet to develop each year, and recognize that the Republic of Mexico, which is in the watershed, has an entitlement to the river as well. So, in the mid-40s, a binational international treaty was negotiated and entered into between the U.S. and the Republic of Mexico, allocating Mexico, or recognizing an allocation in Mexico of 1.5 million acre feet. Another thing that the 22 Compact does, and I'm going to short form some of these references to the law of the river, including this one, it requires the 4 states of Utah, Wyoming, New Mexico, and Colorado to not cause the flow at Leaf Ferry, which is the dividing line between the 2 basins, to be depleted below an aggregate of 75 million acre feet over any 10-year consecutive period. So that's another kind of a fundamental aspect of the 22 Compact. The other, I think, critical element of the law of the river is the 1948 Upper Colorado River Basin Compact. And really the genesis of this compact was the interest among the Upper Basin states to develop their water supplies and requiring federal assistance to do so. However, before Congress would appropriate any money, it required the Upper Basin to clarify its apportionments and how those apportionments would be allocated among the 4 Upper Division states. Just kind of a footnote here, a little bit more than a footnote, is that Arizona has lands in the Upper Basin. So under the 48 Compact, they have an entitlement as well. It's a flat entitlement of 50,000 acre feet per annum. But one of the things that's unique about the 48 Compact is it divvied up allocations based on percentage of available supply, and I think that's really important. I think that, we've heard, especially in the press of late, lots of references to, well, you get a fixed amount, for instance, in the state of Utah, each year based on this 7.5 million acre foot number that I referenced earlier. That is not the case. Under the 48 Compact, the state of Utah, for instance, has an entitlement to 23% of the supply available to the Upper Basin. As you will see in a few minutes, that supply is hugely variable. Another, I think, essential element of the 48 Compact is a provision governing curtailment of use. So in the event that the Upper Division states can't satisfy what I just referred to as the non-depletion obligation under the 22 Compact, not causing the river to be depleted beyond 75 million acre feet over any 10-year rolling period, there is a mechanism in the 48 Compact that addresses curtailment, what the Upper Division states would do in the event of a compact call. Okay, I am now going to move into a little bit of hydrology, which again, as an attorney, is always a challenge. That's why I'm flanked with my staff engineers here to bail me out if things get rough. But I just rattled off a lot of numbers with respect to the various allocations under the 22 Compact. And if you've been doing the math, you have noted that the obligations on the river per the 22 Compact are about 17.5 million acre feet per year. This far exceeds the available supply today, which is really, I think, the essence of the crisis we're faced with. There's a lot going on in this graphic, so I'd like to draw your attention to the 2 red ovals. When the 22 Compact was negotiated 100 years ago, the average annual natural flow of the river was almost 18 million acre feet per annum. That said, we've learned in recent years that the negotiators of the 22 Compact knew that they were allocating volumes that wouldn't likely be there in the future. So the allocation of 17.5 million acre feet was more of a political calculus than anything else, notwithstanding the fact it was negotiated during a very wet period. Okay, this slide, also a lot going on in this slide. this slide, basically, I'm going to kind of shift your focus to the lower portion of the slide. The current annual natural flow on the river, and this really, dates back to the beginning of the millennium drought, which we refer to as the drought of record, the current drought of record that we've been experiencing since 2000. Indicates that our average natural flow is about 13.4 million acre feet. 12.5 is generated in the upper basin, about 1 million acre feet in the lower basin. So we've got a 15 million acre foot draw on this river. We estimate that, that delta between the natural flow and the draw on the river is about 1.5 to 1.6 million acre feet. And that is really what we're contending with today, is this imbalance in the system. And this is a really stark graphic that just kind of underscores this disparity here. You've got a peak combined elevation of both Lake Powell and Lake Mead in 1999 of about 92% of capacity, and in 2022 of about 26% of capacity. So this kind of shows the situation that we're in. And then we've got some trends over time. I rattled off some figures in terms of the total use on the river. What we have seen, and this really tracks the last 3 years, is that the lower basin use is just under 10 million acre feet, and the upper basin use averages about 4.5 million acre feet, with the notable exception of 2021, where our use was around 3.5 million acre feet. One of the things that we experience in the upper basin, and I think it's a concept that is hard for folks in the lower basin to really get their heads around, and that is the concept of hydrologic shortage. We all know that water isn't necessarily available every year to divert to consumptively use. In the lower basin, however, if you're relying on a major reservoir above you to pull your supply, it's a very different calculus. So this slide shows that we were using, on average, about 3.5 million acre feet in 2021, and that was simply because the water wasn't there to consumptively use. I mentioned that the lower basin is relying heavily on Lake Mead to sustain their average, over this time period anyway, of just under 10 million acre feet of consumptive use per annum. This is, again, the kind of the fundamental aspect or element of the crisis that we're dealing with right now are these critically low reservoir elevations. We're looking at a Mead elevation of, record lows, and that in turn is pulling down the elevation of Lake Powell. And what we're embroiled in now in the basin is an effort to protect critical elevations. We have operational criteria that currently are insufficient and inadequate to do that, and I'm going to talk about that here now. I'm going to show this SNOTEL graph just quickly to basically underscore that we can have a really good water year, right? But a good water year doesn't necessarily translate into filling reservoirs, right? We need multiple good water years. So I think that there's a tendency to become a little bit complacent when we have these good water years like we're experiencing this year, and that's a hard one in terms of public perception, how to set the record straight on that. This is a good example of having a good water year and that not translating into inflows into reservoirs. This slide in particular shows the disconnect between snowpack and inflow, using water year 2021 as an example. So in 2021, our snowpack was about 89% of average, but inflows into Lake Powell were just 33% of average. We had a similar situation occur in 2022. We had about 100% snowpack with a 63% runoff. And this is really due in large part to climate change, right? We've got hotter temperatures that result in evaporation and drier soils. Dry soils act as a sponge, essentially soaking up water and reducing flows as a result. Now, I think I skipped some slides here, so I'm going to make you dizzy here. If I go backward, perhaps not. Okay, looks like I've covered everything. I'm bringing it current now, and probably to the reason why you are all here today, and we've got such robust attention. So I have mentioned that we're dealing with critical reservoir elevations in both Lakes Mead and Lake Powell. Let me focus a little bit to kind of some of the negotiations and the politics that we have been dealing with really since mid last year. In June, and you're looking at a photo of Reclamation Commissioner Camille Touton. Commissioner Touton testified before the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee and said, we are in a dire situation based on immediate forecasts in terms of protecting critical elevations at Lake Powell and Lake Mead. And as a result, states, I am calling on you to, by August, so this is again 7 months ago, so August of 2022, to develop plans to address the situation on the river. Specifically to conserve between 2 and 4 million acre feet as early as 2023 to address the crisis on the river. Well, the August deadline came and went. The states were unable to come up with plans, and I would put a footnote here. The lower basin states were unable to come up with a plan. The upper division states created a plan, what we call a 5-point plan, which essentially involved voluntary conservation in the form of what we call system conservation and demand management, very active water administration and regulation. I mentioned hydrologic shortage. Earlier, we have regulators in each of our 4 upper division states, state engineers, who are shutting off junior uses, right, because the water is not there. And then responsible use of some of the federal dollars that we've seen of late. There's been a big infusion of federal funds to deal with water issues. So those were kind of the essential elements of the 5-point plan. Nevertheless, fast forward to fall of last year, when projections were that much grimmer. And so as a result, the federal government, through the Bureau of Reclamation, issued a notice of intent to modify the existing operations on the river. Many of you have referred to the 2007 Interim Guidelines, which essentially set forth the operational criteria for the river. They govern shortages in the lower basin and the coordinated operations of these 2 major reservoirs, Lakes Mead and Powell. The idea is we need to modify these guidelines to respond to these critical conditions. The guidelines are insufficient, and so are some successor agreements, including the 2019 Drought Contingency Plan. So it has, I think fair to say, been an all-hands-on-deck effort since the fall, and it really ramped up over the month of January to develop what we're referring to as a consensus framework alternative. One of the elements of this SEIS process, and again, this is all pursuant to NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, was an invitation for the states, together with key stakeholders, and I'm thinking about our tribal partners and some in the NGO community, to come together and develop an alternative based on a consensus approach. And that's precisely what we've been working on over the month of January. We were able to come up with a 6-state alternative, and this alternative includes the states of Utah, New Mexico, Wyoming, Colorado, all 4 of the upper division states, and the lower division states of Arizona and Nevada. California was not able to sign on to the alternative, and it has proposed its own alternative. I want to be clear for the folks in the audience that are not NEPA practitioners. I certainly am not, although as a water attorney and water manager, I've certainly had to dabble in it. But this is not a proposal beyond a request that the Bureau of Reclamation model this alternative that we're putting forward. Let me give you some very general ideas about what our alternative contains. I'm going to try to stay out of the weeds here, but I'll just give you kind of a high-level summary of what the six-state alternative entails, and then I'm going to turn to the the California alternative. So the six-state alternative basically contemplates in the lower basin deeper reductions at higher elevations, not waiting until the reductions that are circumscribed under the 07 guidelines or the drought contingency plan. The other thing, and this was a major, I think, win for the upper basin, was an agreement by the states of Arizona and Nevada in particular to begin to assess losses resulting from evaporation and other system losses. You know, heretofore, the lower basin never had to take reductions based on evaporation. And we estimate evaporative losses to be on the order of about 1.5 million acre feet per annum. So this is not an insignificant amount of water. So this was a big, I think, a big development, a big win, if you will, in terms of this consensus-based proposal. The other thing that it, I think, has accomplished in terms of the proposal is an understanding in the upper basin that we do experience hydrologic shortage. So our contribution under the six-state proposal would be voluntary conservation in the upper basin. So again, voluntary conservation in light of the available supply. So if we have difficult hydrologic years in the upper basin where we experience natural shortage, any contributions that we may make will be limited necessarily. The other element in terms of the upper basin and really the coordinated operations of both Lakes Mead and Powell are fixed and reduced releases from Lake Powell at various elevations. And that's really an effort to shore up volumes in Lake Powell in order to keep those critical elevations stabilized. The two benchmark, I keep talking about critical elevations here, and I want to provide a little meat on the bone, if you will. So there are a couple of critical elevations that we've been operating around at Lake Powell over the last couple of years. One is elevation 3525, which is a part and parcel of our drought contingency plan in the upper basin. And that elevation is critical operationally because it provides a buffer over the truly critical elevation of 3590, at which point critical infrastructure is compromised at Glen Canyon Dam and power production ceases. So 3490 is an elevation that we have been managing around now because the hydrology has been so dry. We've kind of blown past this buffer elevation of 3525, and we have been really managing around this elevation of 3490. In terms of the six-state proposal, the critical elevation that we're really targeting managing around is elevation 3500 at Lake Powell. And so the operations with respect to limiting or fixing releases from Lake Powell are all keyed around trying to maintain an elevation of 3500. The same is true for Lake Mead, except Lake Mead's critical elevation pursuant to our six-state proposal is elevation 1000. The other aspect of the six-state proposal from an upper basin standpoint is consideration of additional releases from upstream reservoirs. Now, some of you may be familiar with or have heard about releases that are ongoing from Flaming Gorge Reservoir. And these releases have occurred in both 2021 and they're currently underway for the 2022-2023 year. And that is really with the objective to shore up elevations at Lake Powell. So we are currently in the midst of releasing 500,000 acre feet from Flaming Gorge to shore up Lake Powell elevations. That is another element of this six-state plan, is an attempt to use this existing agreement pursuant to its terms to make additional releases from Flaming Gorge. Now, I'm going to wear a Utah hat here with respect to these releases. Flaming Gorge plays an outsized role in terms of releases from these upper facilities, which are we refer to as the initial units. Blue Mesa in Colorado being another initial unit, Navajo Reservoir in New Mexico being another. Flaming Gorge has really been the focal point here because it's got the most water, frankly. We've got the most opportunity to send water from Flaming Gorge to Powell to make a difference. However, there is an element of the existing agreement that enables us to do this that requires that any water that we send down to Lake Powell must, number one, be effective in terms of maintaining those elevations. And when I mean effective, in large part what I'm referring to is cannot be released to our sister states in the lower basin, right? Can't be released from Flaming Gorge simply to flow down to Lake Powell just to be released from the very thirsty lower basin states. And then also any releases out of Flaming Gorge must be fully recovered. We have to put Flaming Gorge back into the same spot it was but for these operations. And so that's a very important thing. It's a tenet of this agreement that I've referred to. It's a commitment that we're making under the 6-state proposal, and it's especially important to the state of Utah. I'm going to shift gears for a minute and just sketch out the California proposal. And I'll tell you something. This, again, I mentioned at the outset that this is either an auspicious or an inauspicious week to be doing this presentation because so much has occurred. We released and literally put the finishing touches on our 6-state proposal close of business Monday. And we received California's proposal, I think it was probably 8 p.m. Mountain Time on Tuesday. So this is all almost real time as far as this river goes. It has been, it's been quite a week. So let me just kind of sketch out the California proposal at a very high level. California is proposing to basically accept evaporation losses, not quite in the amounts that the 6-state proposal contemplates. So I mentioned 1.5 million acre feet. But they're willing to accept something on the order of 1 million acre feet, and they're not willing to accept those unless they are divvied up in priority. Now, California is a senior on the river, right? In terms of prior appropriation, they are the most senior and they're the biggest water users. So California is intent on making sure that any sort of additional reductions, including for evaporation, are assessed based on priority. Same with additional reductions. California is open to taking additional reductions, but at very low levels. So it wouldn't be until Lake Mead is hitting elevation 1025 before these really deep reductions would kick in. And again, California has underscored that they want those reductions to be assessed based on priority. Now, what does that mean in terms of what we're dealing with? That Arizona would take the hit as the junior user in the lower basin on the system. Now, Nevada plays in this as well, but Nevada's allocation, its entitlement is so small, relatively speaking, that really the two states that have the skin in the game in terms of reductions are Arizona and California. So California has had a really hard time with how to assess these reductions, both for evaporation and the additional deeper reductions based on elevations. And that is something that has been a hurdle in terms of coming up with a 7-state proposal. I think I'm going to finish up here by just saying that it's a temptation to criticize California. I mean, we're kind of want to do in the upper basin, but I want to just note that California stayed at the table until the very end. They were at the negotiating table. And our 6-state proposal anticipates that California will participate. So California is going to have to be part of the solution regardless. I'm going to just wrap it up here, and I realize that I titled my presentation Crisis or Opportunity. I think I've hopefully made a case in terms of how critical this is, but I do believe it's an opportunity. I believe it's an opportunity for the states to come together and to really dictate from here on out how operations occur on the river. Our current operational criteria is insufficient. I think that the states really hold the solutions as we should, given our status on the river. And I think that we need to be, in a very honest way, engaging with some of our key water users. And I'm really going to identify the tribes here. There are 30 sovereign tribes in the Colorado River system basin, and they have historically been kept out of the room, kept out of the discussions. You look at certain states like the state of Arizona, the Arizona tribes have really been part of the solution to managing some of these shortfalls in the state of Arizona, and I'm hopeful that we can get to a point where the tribes are participating meaningfully, because I do think that they are a big part of the solution. And with that, I think I'm just going to wrap it up, and I've given you a lot of information. I hope that I've provided the groundwork for some good questions. Thank you, Bob, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, Amy. Extraordinarily informative, and indeed, you did generate some questions.
Good.
So I will share those, and let me invite folks both here in the room and virtually to submit additional questions. We've got about between 20 and 25 minutes to try to answer them.
Fantastic.
And before I start with the questions, I do, one question asks if there are copies of the slides available
Certainly.
from today's presentation. And the presentation has been, in essence, filmed and will be available on the Stegner Center website under programs, I believe. So if anyone is interested in following up to both see the presentation again and the slides, they will be available. So an initial question is, in your opinion, will the Colorado Compact states, upper and lower, make an accommodated solution, or will Congress have to get involved?
It's a great question. Typically, the states like to chart their own course. And we will only, I think, reluctantly engage in legislative fixes unless we're pretty certain about where we want to go. To be extremely candid with this group of 200. And I'm going to use a recent example, and that is the 2019 Drought Contingency Plan. That was a plan that was agreed to. There's an upper basin and a lower basin. I touched on that when I was talking about some of these releases from upstream reservoirs as part of the Upper Basin Drought Contingency Plan. By the time we approached Congress for authorizing legislation for the 2019 Drought Contingency Plan, we had formulated the plan. The states had reached agreement on the plan. And while I think that there is a place for Congress, I do firmly believe that the states need to chart their own course and to come up with a solution before we kind of revert to the legislative process.
Good. I think everyone's afraid of Congress these days.
Right. Although I do want to, shout out to Congress for all of the money that is being appropriated to address some of these issues. That is, and I don't mean to be glib, but I think that's very important. We are better situated right now in terms of federal funding than we ever have been on the river, and I think there are opportunities there.
And I should be clear that my comment was directed toward direct congressional intervention into the
right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Question: what is the general distribution of use of Colorado River water throughout the state of Utah?
Well, that's general distribution of use. I mean, I can say just as a a general matter that about 80% of Colorado River use in the state of Utah, and I really think across the basin, is in ag. You know, I mentioned hydrologic shortage earlier in terms of how that really impacts our uses. I think based on a full supply in the state of Utah, we're just using right around 1 million acre feet per annum. But again, remember that Utah's allocation pursuant to the 48 Compact is 23% of the available supply. So you've got a water year like 2021 where the total upper basin use was 3.5 million acre feet per annum. You know, states didn't get near what they would have typically or on average used over that period, which, you know, we see an average use in the upper basin of about 4.5.
You've got a couple questions here related to Lake Mead. Let me sort of combine them.
Sure.
One asks you to address the proposal, to go into a little more detail, to fill Lake Mead first as a part of the solution, as I understand the question. But the second question then is more specific. When do you foresee dead pool effect at Lake Mead?
Well, yeah, I'm not really sure how to. I'm gonna defer to Jack Schmidt at Utah State to talk about Phil Mead first, because that's his. You know, I think that was his concept. You know, dead pool at Mead is 895, and I think what we're trying to do in terms of the 6-state plan and really managing around this Lake Mead elevation of 1,000 feet is to avoid that, right? I mean, that's what we're protecting against. You know, dead pool at Powell of, you know, 3370 and change. I mean, these are the things that we're trying to manage around. And we want to create enough of a buffer so that we're not looking at these dead pool elevations in the face, as it were.
The question is, what's the theory of equity that the state of Utah is using for its proposed 6-state, or for the proposed 6-state plan? And then goes on to ask, is it population, financial resources, each state having an equal equity claim, or is a metric based on the national interest or individual state interests?
That's an interesting question. So in terms of equity, I mean, you know, this is the lawyer in me, right? Very loaded term. You could define it myriad ways. I want to be clear that in the 6-state plan, the upper basin is not taking any reductions. What we're bringing to the table is a mechanism whereby we can make voluntary contributions, right, to address the situation. So I think that in essence goes to the question about equity. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the upstream releases out of Flaming Gorge, right? We in the state of Utah, and I put a fine point on this because I think this impacts Utah more so than any of the upper division states, maybe with the exception of Wyoming. But I do think that there are real equity concerns there, right? You're dealing with communities that rely on Flaming Gorge. That rely on water levels really being sustained at Flaming Gorge. And that's something that we need to think about, I think, seriously in the state of Utah when we come to the table as 4 states and we vote on or we decide whether or not to send additional water to Flaming Gorge. That, in my mind, is an equity issue. But I do think that, you know, our mechanism for doing that is we have a vote. We get to decide whether or not we will support those releases and how that water will be accounted for. I mean, one of the things that I'm especially concerned about is if the ostensible purpose of sending this water downstream to Lake Powell is to shore up Lake Powell operations, how does it make sense then to turn around and release that water to the lower basin? That, in my mind, is an equity issue, and I think that's an equity issue in Utah in particular.
That raises a question in my mind. One is a mechanical question.
Sure.
On the mechanical side of things, procedurally, the six upper basins, or 6 states have come together and have the proposal that you've described. If one of those states, let's just say Colorado, just to pull a name out of the hat, had decided they weren't keen about that, would that proposal still have gone forward under the 6 states, or would it have been a 5-state proposal with both Colorado and California, I guess, having separate proposals? In other words, does a majority vote carry the day?
That's a great question. So, actually kind of a tough one to answer. So at this point, let me be clear about what it is we're committing to, because if you rely on the press for this, it's not clear, right? So what we've committed to as 6 states is we've committed to forwarding a proposal pursuant to this NEPA process, right? The supplemental EIS that is underway to modify the current operational regime, really the 2007 guidelines. It's not a consensus-based proposal. It's a request that reclamation model our consensus-based modeling effort. So what that will look like, Bob, at the end of the day remains to be seen, right? This is a federal NEPA process. The feds could take elements of our 6-state proposal and elements of the California proposal. Do I think that any of the 6 states will renege on putting this request that reclamation model this alternative forward? No, I don't. I think that we're all very solid. But again, I want to underscore that our proposal necessitates the involvement of California. So there will definitely be, I think, we will, at the end of the day, see an amalgam of elements of these proposals. We think our proposal is very solid, it makes sense, and going back to the equity question, it's equitable.
Just to clarify the equitable part of this, if the EIS process reveals that there's a substantial evaporation loss, presumably there's less water moving down the river.
Right.
And then is the thought that the upper basin and the lower basin states would share equitably in what's left. In other words, that would be the sort of driving factor in dividing the water moving forward.
Well, that's a great question, but I will say we have always recognized evaporation in the upper basin as a physical reality. And that's demonstrated in terms of the volumes that pass Lee Ferry, truly. I mean, that is all accounted for. That's a physical reality. I do want to be careful. I have short-formed the acknowledgement both in the 6-state plan and in California's plan around evaporation. Evaporation, it happens, it's real. However, I want to be clear that evaporation, if you look at the plain language of these proposals, you won't see the word evaporation. Right, evaporation is being couched as these reductions in the 6-state plan as infrastructure protection volume. And in the California proposal, I believe it's additional measures during the interim or something like that, precisely because if you read within the 4 corners of the notice of intent to develop this SEIS, the U.S. said, we're not going to consider evaporation and any sort of associated losses in the context of this NEPA process. That's outside the scope. So we wanted to make sure that these losses were accounted for because they are a physical reality, recognizing and observing the fact that the U.S. is going to do an ancillary study along with this SEIS process on evaporation and loss. So I guess the bottom line is it gets us where we need to be in terms of actual physical wet water reductions, but we don't call it evaporation.
Got you. Okay. So you made mention of this, And the question is, how involved were the tribal nations that have an interest in the Colorado River in putting together the six-state and or the California proposals?
So I am going to, again, be very candid, and I would say the tribes were not involved enough. And here I think is why, in my opinion, is we were operating on a 45-day window where we were moving very quickly as states. However, and I know that I might just turn it over to Heather Tanana to provide her perspective, because I would definitely welcome a tribal perspective on this. But I think we have made strides. I think particularly in the Upper Basin, we have been communicating with 6 Upper Basin Colorado River tribes on a very regular basis. In fact, not only weekly, sometimes bi-weekly over the last 45 days, as we were developing our proposal, as the Upper Basin was taking what we needed to see and what ultimately ended up being a 6-state plan and vetting that with the tribes, sometimes in real time, before we'd even done the modeling on some of these concepts. So I am encouraged by this. Again, I think we can do better. I think we will do better. But I think particularly in the Upper Basin, we have made an effort to engage with our tribes in a meaningful way and in a very candid way. So I don't know, Heather, if you want to weigh in on this with your perspective, that's mine.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a process, right? Of like, I've been really optimistic that every state now in the basin. Oh, thanks, Bob. Yeah, every state in the basin is recognizing the failure to include tribes historically, but also now the need to include them. So I absolutely agree. Like, that's a huge change and not one to disregard lightly. The real challenge, I believe, is what that means in practice, and it's still being worked out. But, you know, the legislation that created the authority does have a tribal seat, and really is one of the first kinds to include a consultation policy. So maybe you might say where the authority is on putting together that consultation policy.
Yeah.
Sorry, who's Heather?
I'm a research professor here at the University of Utah. Then Heather Tanana, citizen of Navajo Nation, and do a lot of work on Colorado River Basin.
And actually, if I could add to Heather's comments, I kind of gave short shrift to the Colorado River Authority of Utah, right? The newest water entity, state entity dealing with water in the state. But Heather is exactly right. We, during the last regular legislative session, the Utah legislature created a seat on the authority board, specifically a tribal seat, and also a consultation provision for appropriate consultation between the authority and Utah's federally recognized tribes. And I think with the exception of the state of New Mexico, I don't believe any of the other upper division states have tribal seats in terms of their governing boards. And then the other thing is the Colorado River Authority of Utah is a very unique entity. There is really no corollary in the Upper Basin, any water entity that's specifically devoted to Colorado River interests. And so I think that was really prescient of the Utah legislature and the governor to create a devoted entity that ensures that Utah's entitlements to its Colorado River allocations are satisfied and that our obligations are met.
So the next question, I think, takes us back to, I think it was John Muir who said, when you pull one thread in the ecological system, another one gets pulled. It's all interconnected. Anyway, so the question is, what does the Upper Basin proposal mean for the proposed Lake Powell pipeline? And goes on to say, it seems like it would make the pipeline untenable.
So that's an interesting question. I never seem to get away with not speaking about LPP, right, in any of these presentations. And honestly, I'm not hearing much about LPP these days, except I want to do a big shout out to Washington County, who has really doubled down on focusing on conservation over development in the short term, given the realities on this river. I mentioned earlier, apropos LPP, Utah is entitled to 23% of the supply available to the upper basin. Nothing more and nothing less, right? So any new development in the basin, LPP is really, I think, takes a lot of shots because there's a lot going on in terms of Washington County being the lower basin and how that comports or doesn't with the compact. But there are other development projects underway in the upper basin. And I think that what Utah is grappling with, whether it's LPP or anything else involving the development of water, is what that available supply is. And right now we know that we don't, our available supply is at an all-time low. So that will necessarily constrain it. Does this play into the 6-state proposal in any way? I'm not sure there's a direct link, but I certainly think the linkage is there in terms of the compact and what our entitlement is and how it's limited.
You've mentioned, we talked about evaporation a bit, but a couple of questions to tie together on that. Why hasn't evaporation been counted previously? And then related to that, are there adequate monitoring devices on the river to monitor usage? Are there scientific tools that would be able to resolve the evaporation amount question? And in particular, comparing the 6-state evaporation amount with California's, for example.
Right. So that's an excellent question, and I would have to get really into the intricacies of the law of the river in terms of why evaporation has not been assessed historically against lower basin uses. It really goes back to very protracted litigation between Arizona and California in the 50s and 60s. Which we short form as Arizona v. California, and that decree. And the lower division states could make an argument that they're not obligated to accept any EVAP losses with respect to their allocations. That is, again, a legal argument that can be made, but I'm really encouraged to see that each of the 3 lower division states is now acknowledging the physical reality, not just a legal position. And I include California here. All 3 are willing to kind of come to the table and say, these are the laws of physics, right? Evaporation happens, and we've got to deal with it, and we've got to reduce uses accordingly.
So this question builds on that. I think you've already given the answer, but I'll pose the question from the audience. Is there a legal mechanism to overcome California's legal claim to priority right over the Colorado River?
There certainly is, but I don't think the upper basin wants to get into that fight. Let's let the lower basin figure out the priority issues. I think, and again, the law of the river, I mentioned at the outset, right? This is what governs the operations of the river, is also, in my mind, what keeps us out of court, right? We remain at the table. We have come up with a lot of very elaborate rules, criteria to govern this river because we don't want our destiny controlled by the courts. In this case, it would be the high court. These would be original actions between the states. And we don't want Congress to dictate outcomes, right? So I'm going to leave the discussion and the arguments about priority to the lower division states. I think it is in our collective best interest to keep this out of litigation and out of court.
I guess sort of related to that, do you have a read on where Bureau of Reclamation's decision-making under this uncertainty framework is coming from? Do they seem to be setting themselves up to force decisions about the allocation of water in the river and imposing cuts?
Well, I think, again, these are great questions, and I don't have a crystal ball up here, although I've got water, which I appreciate. The idea here is that reclamation is handling this, approaching this through a NEPA process, right? That's the mechanism that we are dealing with currently. We're going to have a draft supplemental EIS, hopefully in the late March timeframe, with a final supplemental EIS somewhere in late July, and that really has to do with decisions that are made in August regarding operation of the river for the subsequent year. I do think that Reclamation is using the process that they need to use at this point, which is the NEPA process. I want to just kind of revert back to a comment that I just made regarding litigation. I do believe that litigation, sadly, is going to be inevitable with respect to this NEPA process. But I think that when it comes to litigation, original action, such that we saw in Arizona v. California, that is something that we do try to avoid. There's always litigation on the river, but if we bring it to an order of magnitude, such as an original action, we'll never be able to deal with a short-term crisis on the river. We're going to be mired in litigation, and that's not a solution.
We've got a couple more minutes. I'll try to get a couple more questions in. Have there been any discussions or proposals to create a multi-state fund to fund things like desalination, pipelines, et cetera, to assist in maintaining water levels?
It's a great question. Let me talk a little bit about augmentation. So whether it's desal or any other, we've had a lot of discussion on this river about augmenting supplies. In 2012, the Bureau of Reclamation did a fairly large water supply and demand study where they basically evaluated pipelines from the Mississippi and the Missouri River, desalination opportunities. Desalination is expensive, and one of the key stakeholders here that I just touched on is the Republic of Mexico. We negotiate with the Republic of Mexico through a separate binational process, but they're going to play a role here in terms of additional reductions, and they've been a very willing partner. We've had lots of discussions of late based on some of these binational agreements about desalination opportunities in the Republic of Mexico. So Sea of Cortez, Pacific Ocean desal. These are quite expensive endeavors. And while I think the idea of funds, and I think, again, I mentioned the wherewithal of the federal government these days in terms of these huge appropriations to fix problems on the river. This might be a worthy cause, but these are not short-term solutions. These are solutions with a much longer trajectory. And then there are arguments about, to use an adage, whether the juice is worth the squeeze, right? How much water can we actually realize from desal? And we've got disposal issues that brings in an environmental concern and that sort of thing. So I think it's definitely something that we need to be thinking about. We need to be thinking about all options on the table. But that's not a short-term fix. It's expensive. Feds need to be involved. I think the major desal opportunities may be binational, and that's a whole other discussion.
Let me wrap it up with one final question with a legal angle to it.
Sure.
Do you know how many alternatives the Bureau of Reclamation is including in the NEPA process?
Great question. So currently, if you look at the plain language of the NOI, the Notice of Intent, there are 3 alternatives on the table. There's a no action, which is part and parcel of any NEPA process, right? Let's just continue operations status quo, which we know is the river crashes are not sufficient. The second is an operation that basically the federal alternative in terms of managing the two reservoirs. And then the third and fourth now are the 6-state consensus alternative that we've asked be evaluated, and California's alternative. Now, whether other stakeholders will come together and propose alternatives is unknown to me. We were given a deadline of the end of January to propose our alternatives, so I don't know all of what's at play, but certainly we've got, I think, 4 on the table.
Well, Amy, thank you very much.
Certainly.
Before I conclude, let me just mention that on February 16th, as part of this the Stegner Center Audubon Society Water Series, that we will be addressing measuring water use, the good, the bad, and the ugly, presented by Rick Malloy, who's a water conservation manager for the Central Utah Water Conservancy District. And I'll mention again the Stegner Center Symposium on March 16th and 17th on the future of the Great Salt Lake. And with that, please join me in thanking Amy for this very informative presentation about where we are right up to date in the Colorado